Alhaitham is the premier Dendro DPS in Genshin Impact. At least I think he's supposed to be. His Dendro damage output is pretty solid, and he actually reminds me a little bit of someone else. Where have I seen this before? Jokes aside, there's a lot more to his kit than there is for someone like Kuting, so if you want to learn how to play him, this is where you should be. Today I'm going to be talking about his best build, how to play Alhaitham, some team options, and whether or not it's worth getting Constellations. So with all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Alhaitham's kit. First off, the kit section for Alhaitham is going to be insanely long just because he's pretty complicated, so if you want to figure him out yourself, you can skip ahead to a different section in the video, but I definitely recommend listening through this. First things first, Alhaitham is not an easy character to master. He's not just press E and spam normal and charged attacks for as long as you want. Sure, you can play him however, but his kit has some uptime problems that you can basically only address if you use proper rotations or at the very minimum understand how it works. So I'm going to be going over everything you need to know to hopefully make him easier to play. Just looking at his basic attacks, the scaling is pretty low, which means he'll need to be played in reaction teams to get solid value, and we'll talk about that later in the video. His entire kit revolves around what's called Chisel Light Mirrors, and essentially what they do is convert Alhaitham's basic attacks to Dendro damage. And for every mirror that you have, his basic attacks gain additional instances of Dendro damage when they connect. Now these Dendro damage hits are counted as skill damage, and we'll talk about his skill right after this. You can have a maximum of 3 mirrors up at a time, and 1 mirror will disappear every 4 seconds unless it gets refreshed. So when you use his elemental skill, he's going to teleport forward if you tap, or to wherever you aim it if you hold. After the teleport, he deals Dendro damage, and the multiplier on it is pretty solid. When you cast his skill, he gains 2 mirrors unless you already have a mirror active, in which case he only gains 1 mirror. Basically, all this means is that you can get between 4 and 8 seconds of Dendro infusion with his skill when you use it alone. One of the major downsides of his skill is that it has an 18-second cooldown, and if you switch off of Alhaitham, you lose all of your mirrors, so basically if you mess up, you need to reset or wait 18 seconds. He's not really flexible in that way. That sort of gets fixed with his first Ascension passive, which will give him a mirror when he uses a charged or plunging attack up to once every 12 seconds, but ideally that becomes a mirror in your rotation rather than a backup that you have to use because you misplayed. Also, his mirrors can generate Dendro particles on hit, but it has a pretty short cooldown and only generates 1 particle at a time. This means that as long as you have mirrors up, you can give Alhaitham energy, but it's not really a ton of energy. His burst costs 70, which is fairly high, and deals damage based on how many mirrors you have out at the time of using it. It also will give you mirrors based on the amount that you have. Less is more, so if you have 0 mirrors when you burst, he'll gain 3, and if you have 3 mirrors, he won't gain any. His burst can deal a handful of damage, but it's actually more important to use his burst towards the start of his field time to instantly gain 3 mirrors, at least below C6. In my experience playing the character, I actually recommend starting with his burst so that you can get the 3 mirrors, which will give you 12 seconds of Dendro uptime, and then you can use his Ascension passive to gain a mirror back after you lose your first one with a charged attack, and then use a skill when you lose another mirror. You can also flip these two things around if you want to use a skill before his Ascension passive mirror. The main point is that you want to keep up 3 mirrors for as long as possible because that's going to be more Dendro damage, more Dendro instances, and more opportunities for reactions as well. If you don't have his burst up, you can use his skill and a charged attack to get 3 mirrors, but just make sure that you're not using his burst at the end of his rotation or at the end of his field time. You do get more burst damage the more mirrors you have active when you use his burst, however, it's not as important to get that damage than it is to make sure that you have 3 mirrors at the start of his field time every time. So make sure to use his burst at the beginning of his field time. Now, one thing that you can do that's really cool is actually switch between characters and use a skill or even sometimes a burst before mirrors go out. It depends on your ping. If you have really bad ping, you might not be able to get away with this, but in this clip, you can see me use Alhaitham's burst, put down Oz on Fischl, and then swap back and still gain the 3 mirrors. This is because the mirrors go out after the burst is cast, which means that you can still catch them if you're quick enough. As for character scalings, his second Ascension passive gives his mirrors more damage bonus based on his elemental mastery stat. Alhaitham's skill and burst also have partial elemental mastery scaling, which will affect the artifacts we use on him later. Lastly, talent priority isn't that big of a deal with him because you want to level all of his talents in general, but I would start with his skill. I know that's a lot of information, so if any of it didn't make sense to you, or if you have questions, leave a comment down below and either myself or a community member will probably be able to help you out at some point. Alternatively, you can come to my live streams at twitch.tv/Braxophone to ask questions, or skip back to the previous timestamp. Next up, let's talk about artifacts. Alhaitham's got decent flexibility when it comes to artifact sets. The main thing you're going to need to look at is your character lineup and main stats. First up, if you're below AR45, gamblers, martial artists, and instructors can all be pretty solid sets for him. For stats, you want to go attack or elemental mastery sands, DENDRO damage or attack goblet, and an attack or crit damage circlet. That said, it's not super worth farming before AR45 for artifacts, since at AR45 you can dump all of your fragile resin on the domains that will guarantee 5-star ones, so I would just give him the right stats and not worry about sets just yet. For those of you who are AR45 and up, you'll want to look at your team and see if anyone's running Deepwood Memories or can run Deepwood Memories. It's a good set for him, but he can get higher damage if you give someone else the set and give Alhaitham EM sets. Technically, his best option is Gilded Dreams just due to the big stats it gives him, but you can also mix and match 2-piece elemental mastery sets and get pretty similar damage turnout. Between 4-piece Gilded or mix and match 2 sets, I'd recommend just going with the setup that gives you better substats. If you don't have another character on Deepwood Memories, then you want to give that to Alhaitham. Deepwood should be your first priority because it shreds enemy DENDRO resistance, which will significantly increase your damage dealt. But ideally, you give Deepwood to another character and max out Alhaitham's stats since he'll be on-field dealing damage. Deepwood Memories is amazing, just like everyone who's watched this far and is already subscribed to the channel to make videos like these happen. And if you're not subscribed, I'll just give you a second. Thanks. Lastly, you can also mix in 2-piece emblem for energy recharge if you need to. On the topic of energy recharge, Alhaitham needs a lot of it. He doesn't generate a lot of particles himself, so you have to compensate with your stats and support characters. That said, you can't really double down on energy recharge because that would take away from his personal damage. This is one of the main issues that Alhaitham has, and in this case, I recommend running a second DENDRO character with him like Nahida or DENDRO main character. By running another DENDRO with him that generates some DENDRO particles, it can bring his energy requirements down to around 130 to 150%. If you run without a second DENDRO, he can require anywhere between 160 and 200% energy recharge to be able to burst consistently, or for you to run some other Favonius characters in your party. So I definitely recommend double DENDRO. Since Alhaitham has dual scaling, you should default to giving him an Elemental Mastery Sands, DENDRO Damage Goblet, and a crit rate or damage circlet. If you're running an Elemental Mastery weapon and don't have a great Elemental Mastery Sands, attack percent Sands can be okay, but generally it's going to be worse than Elemental Mastery. Keep in mind that you'll be getting spreads in most teams you run him in as well, which makes Elemental Mastery even more valuable. Lastly, on the main stats, if you have virtually no energy recharge substats and don't have a second DENDRO you're playing him with, you can use an energy recharge Sands. For substats, try to hit that threshold of 130 to 150% energy recharge first, then go for crit and Elemental Mastery substats. Attack percent is okay too. Just to reiterate and make this easier for everyone, give Deepwood to someone on your team. Then give Alhaitham EM-based sets. If nobody on your team is using Deepwood, give it to Alhaitham. Elemental Mastery Sands, DENDRO Damage Goblet, and a crit circlet. Outside of just artifacts, you probably also want to know what weapons to use on him, so let's talk about those now. Alhaitham is a pretty great case for weapons because he has a lot of options, with some being free to play. First up, his best in slot is his signature, Light of Foliar Incision. It's going to give a bit of crit rate and increases normal attack and skill damage by a portion of Elemental Mastery after he deals elemental damage with his normal attacks. It's tailor-made for him, but don't get baited into pulling for it because there's other options you may already have that are still pretty solid. Jade Cutter and Mist Splitter are basically neck and neck for him, assuming that you have max stacks on Mist Splitter. Both are powerful crit stat swords and give him a lot of value. Up there with Mist Splitter and Jade Cutter is Haran, which gives elemental damage bonus and still has a crit main stat. Freedom Sworn is actually pretty good on him as well, since he likes elemental mastery and can also get all the buffs activated. Now, if you remember the Umbrella from the recent event, in single target scenarios, that weapon is very strong on Alhaitham due to the elemental mastery main stat and damage bonus passive. In multi-target though, it can fall off in damage to be pretty close with Iron Sting. Iron Sting is not a bad option, it's free to play craftable, and the Black Sword is also pretty solid if you have refinements on it. That said, don't feel like you need to buy the battle pass for Alhaitham. If you have Ye Old Festering Desire, that weapon is fine for him as well if you need energy recharge, since it's going to increase your skill damage, which affects your mirrors. Favonius Sword and Sapwood Blade are also okay options if you're lacking energy recharge on your artifacts. Technically speaking, just due to the insane crit value it can give, Harbinger of Dawn is the best free to play option, but the problem is that it's going to be hard hard to keep up the passive in most Dendro teams. There are mechanics that bleed your HP, and below 90% HP, it instantly becomes way worse, so if you're confident you can keep your HP up in something like Hyper Bloom or just in a team without a shielder, feel free to use it, but I don't really recommend it. Another option I don't really recommend is Lion's Roar, because in my experience playing Alhaitham, you're usually running to Dendro and you don't really have a lot of Electro Aura, even when you do have Quicken Up. Those are all the weapons that I recommend for Alhaitham. Worst case, as a free-to-play player, you should aim to build Iron Sting for him if you don't have any of the better ones. If you really want your Alhaitham to be strong though, you're gonna need a pretty strong team. So let's talk about teammates. So I wanted to make a separate teams video initially to explain it more in depth, but in this guide, I'm still going to go over some basic tips and strong teammates for Alhaitham. So Alhaitham has two main team types you're playing him in. Most of the time, you're going to be playing him in a spread team, which is basically the aggravate equivalent for Dendro, or a Hyper Bloom team. You can play him together in something like Burgeon or Nilu Bloom, but Burgeon is just strictly worse than Hyper Bloom as of making this video, and Alhaitham is replaceable in Nilu Bloom teams by other characters. So for the purpose of making this video, we're going to be focusing on Hyper Bloom and spread. So the first team example that I want to show you is a spread team that's going to be focused on Nahida, Yaimiko, Kuki, and Alhaitham. Now, there's so many substitutes for this team. There's so many characters that you can use to make it work that I just want to talk about each character's function and who they can be replaced by, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. So in Nahida's case, Nahida is going to be the best Dendro to pair with Alhaitham just across the board. The thing is, Nahida adds so much extra Dendro damage while also consistently giving elemental mastery to your on-field character that she can be a really beneficial character to have. She can also hold on to Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, and she's generating a lot of Dendro particles, so generally speaking, she's going to be a very good character to pair with Alhaitham, and if you have the two of them, they're going to be basically glued to each other. That said, if you don't have Nahida, you can go ahead and put Yao Yao in and then replace Kuki with someone else. The thing is, the Dendro energy generation is basically non-existent here, so you're going to have a lot of energy problems with Alhaitham, which is why, generally speaking, I'm going to advise bringing a different healer than Yao Yao, but you can also run Dendro MC if you're like completely free to play, you don't have access to other characters that can fit into this spot. DMC is probably going to be the next best thing in exchange for Nahida if you have to do that. Outside of that, you'll notice that I'm running Yaimiko here. Now, there's actually a very distinct reason I'm running Yaimiko and not Fischl. So Fischl is still a very strong unit, and she's going to be generating a lot of energy particles for you and just doing a lot for the team in general. But the reason I'm not bringing her is because she actually loses out to Yaimiko in damage in this team. Now, if you look at her Ascension 4, it says that if your current active character triggers an Electro-related elemental reaction when Oz is on the field, the opponent gets hit with Electro damage. Basically, this is really good in aggravate teams because you're constantly proccing Electro damage or Electro-related reaction. But the problem is, in spread teams, they don't count as Electro reactions, they count as Dendro reactions because you're dealing Dendro damage. That's not to say that you're not going to be hitting some aggravates, but most of the time you're going to be doing spreads, which means that you lose out on her Ascension 4 passive, and that makes Miko once again more damage than Fischl, and also she's just very pretty and you should use her. Now for the third character, I like to designate Kuki as sort of a flex. You do want to have a healer in these teams. Just with newer content, it's nice to have a healer or a shielder, and right now there's no Dendro shield, and the Electro shield is Beto, which it causes a lot of problems if you're trying to use her as strictly a shielding unit. So ideally, you're going to actually be using a healer in this spot, and I opted for Kuki, but you can bring in Yao Yao if you decide to, or if you want to go with an Animo character to buff your Electro characters, you can do that. The downside is going to be that a lot of the time, you're not going to have many opportunities to actually swirl Electro, because you're going to have so much Dendro output from running double Dendro to try to alleviate Alhaitham's energy issues. So I personally don't really recommend running an Animo here, but you can do it. I just found that Kuki is sort of the best one to put in this spot because running triple Dendro over just double Dendro, double Electro is not as advisable unless you're just really running into uptime issues with Alhaitham. And lastly, if you choose to, you can also run Lisa in this team. Now the thing is, Lisa is very much an on-field unit and Alhaitham's an on-field unit, and so you're going to run into some issues if you try to use them both together, but it is possible, and she can run Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers if you choose to do that. I don't really recommend it, but you can. Basically, the TLDR for this team is that you do want to try to have a healer even though you're not taking self-damage like you would from all the Bloom reactions, and Yaimiko is actually going to be better than Fischl in this team because you're hitting more spreads than Electro Elemental reactions. And next up is going to be Alhaitham's Hyper Bloom team. Now you have a lot of options for Hyper Bloom. This Hydro character can be so many different characters, but if you want to get the most out of it, I would recommend Xingqiu or Yulan. Now between Xingqiu and Yulan is going to be a little bit more damage. However, the difference is going to be that Xingqiu gives you some damage reduction, which can be kind of nice and just more comfortable, and the Hydro application application from Xingqiu is technically a little bit more, so you have more opportunity for blooms themselves to spawn. Between Nahida and Alhaitham, you're going to be spawning a lot of blooms. Hydra is going to be the trigger on spawning the blooms, but you should be blowing them up with Kuki, so you don't have to worry about EM on Nahida, Xingqiu, or Alhaitham for your damage. Obviously, you build EM on the characters that want EM anyways, but these characters are not triggering. It's just going to be the Electro characters, so Kuki you can run just triple EM, and she'll have a lot of great Electro application to sort of blow up those hyper blooms and hit a lot of enemies with a lot of damage, and it can be really, really nice. Alternatively to that, you can also run Lisa and Hyper Bloom. Lisa and Hyper Bloom, the only difference you're going to see here is that, again, these two are going to be fighting for field time, because Lisa wants to use on-field attacks to try to trigger the Hyper Blooms, but when you have her burst up, that no longer becomes an issue. When her burst is up, you can just switch back to Alhaitham, and then the entire duration of the burst she'll be triggering all of the blooms that spawn in that one location. Again, I don't really recommend Lisa for this variant because Alhaitham definitely wants the field, but so does Lisa, and that can cause you some issues. So between these characters, for this team specifically, I don't really recommend Lisa. I'm just saying it's possible. Now, one thing I do want to caution you guys about is running Beto in this team. Beto kind of has some problems triggering Hyper Blooms in general, and not only that, but she's going to have huge energy problems. So even though it is as easy as just slapping in an Electro character with triple EM, not all Electro characters will work. Like Yai Miko will work, Fischl will work, technically Lisa will work, Kuki will work, Raiden will work. Like most of them will work, but Beto will not, Sarah is not advisable, etc. And again, you really want Nahida. You can use Dendro MC for the second Dendro. You can use Yao Yao. Yao Yao is going to give you some problems with energy for Alhaitham, so using Raiden here is okay if you use these two. But if you're using Raiden and you aren't using Yao Yao, you might run into some issues with healing. Basically, there's a lot of nuance to it. You're trying to balance out healing. The most important thing that you need to know is just have an Electro character that's built triple EM that can trigger the Hyper Blooms, and then have a healer somewhere in the team. The healer can also be Kokomi if you choose. And then for the last two teams, you have something like Burgeon if you choose to run it, or you have something like Nilou Bloom, which you can switch characters in and out however you want to do it. But those are basically the four main teams you would run Alhaitham in, and I would recommend using a spread team or a Hyper Bloom team if you choose to do it. I hope you find this helpful, and go ahead and let me know down in the comments who you're going to be playing him with. I'm actually curious. And next up, just in case you're pulling for him, let me tell you about his Constellations. For those of you who really like Alhaitham and want to make him even stronger, here's what his Constellations do. His Constellation 1 reduces his skill cooldown whenever a mirror attack hits an enemy, which can only take effect every second or so. This Constellation looks really good on paper, and for those of us who just unga bunga cavemen and aren't really following strict rotations, it can be pretty nice to reduce your cooldown to between 12 and 14 seconds. That said, it's still a pretty long cooldown, and it doesn't really do much for those following team rotations and high-end content, since you're still going to be waiting out the original regular cooldown anyways, just because that's how the rotation would work. So in my opinion, I'm not really a fan of C1, but some people might like it. C2 is quite a bit better though. It's essentially giving Alhaitham 50 elemental mastery per mirror he puts up with up to 4 stacks. The stack lasts 8 seconds, and even if you can't have 4 mirrors at a time, you can still have 4 stacks. It's a lot of elemental mastery. It's going to be 200 bonus EM, which is more than an elemental mastery Sands will give you, so take that as you will. Constellation 3 increases his skill level by 3, which also increases his mirror damage. It can be a little helpful, but the damage increase isn't really super insane. C4 gives Alhaitham Dendro damage based on how many mirrors you generate with his burst. Since you'll be generating 3 mirrors by using his burst at the start of his rotation or his on-field time, usually this gives you 30% damage bonus. It also gives your party some elemental mastery, which can be strong in most Dendro teams. Constellation 5 is burst level up, which isn't much, and C6 changes up Alhaitham's playstyle. When you use his burst, you'll always gain 3 mirrors regardless of how many you had up when you used it, which means that you can use his burst at the end of his field time or even in the middle to max out damage. He also gains crit rate and damage when you overcap on mirrors, which can make Alhaitham feel a bit more free and a fair bit stronger. As always, I don't recommend Constellations when there are other characters you can get, especially units like Yelan who enable so many different teams, but if you do decide to go for Alhaitham Constellations, C2 is basically the place to stop. C1 feels nearly useless, C4 is great, and C6 is a style change, and ultimately, they're all a lot of money. In my opinion, Alhaitham's strongest constellation is Nahida's Constellation 2. When I first got my hands on Alhaitham, I wasn't a huge fan of how he handled, and I didn't really care for how his kit played out, but after experimenting with him a little bit and getting to know his kit a little bit better, I found that he's a pretty strong character and I think he's fun to play. That said, he definitely has a playstyle that I don't believe would appeal to everybody, and if you're pulling for meta, he can't really be bad because he's a DENDRO character, but he can feel a bit clunky to play if you're not really trying to optimize. Alhaitham feels like one of the few characters in Genshin Impact that rewards high-level play and really punishes low-level play. So for those of you looking for a harder character to master, Alhaitham is there for you, and for those of you who are maybe looking to see how easy and fun the character is to play without having to put too much thought into it, he might not be the best pickup. That said, just pick whoever you want. Honestly, this game's too easy anyways. Thanks for watching, everyone. As usual, if you've enjoyed the video, make sure to like down below and consider subscribing to the channel down below. It really helps me gauge what kind of content you guys want to see, and I appreciate the support a lot. I also go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone, so if you want to check that out, feel free. And if you want to keep up to date on Genshin news and just funny tweets, make sure to follow my Twitter or join the Discord where most of that stuff gets posted. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you next time.